The church bells rang like a heartbeat echoing through the still air, each chime louder than the last, pressing against the chest of everyone waiting inside. The scent of lilies filled the chapel, sunlight streaming through stained glass and scattering colors across the aisle runner. Rows of faces turned toward the door, smiling with expectation, whispering about love and forever. And there she was, Lydia Grace Monroe, the bride, standing at the threshold of her dreams, a bouquet trembling in her hands. Her white gown shimmered like morning snow, her eyes filled with a mix of nerves and hope. She had always dreamed of this day, the day she'd finally marry the man she'd loved. Since high school, Nathan Carter, the man who promised her the moon and swore he'd never let her down. She had spent years waiting, believing in that promise. But promises, like fragile glass, can shatter without warning. The organ music began softly. She took her first step down the aisle. Every eye followed her, every whisper died away. But when she looked toward the altar, toward where Nathan should have been, her heart stopped. The altar was empty. No groom, no vows, no forever. The murmurs started first, quiet and uncertain. Then the silence grew heavy, so heavy she could barely breathe. Her father turned to her, confusion in his eyes. The pastor looked from side to side, frowning. Somewhere in the back, a guest whispered, "He's not coming." Lydia's bouquet loosened in her trembling hands. She tried to smile, tried to believe that maybe Nathan was just late. Maybe his truck broke down. Maybe, just maybe, he'd run into trouble. But her heart already knew. Because that morning he hadn't answered her call. Because last night he'd been distant, his eyes clouded like the coming storm. The music faltered. The organ stopped. And in that unbearable silence, she stood alone in front of 100 witnesses as her world fell apart. Outside, the wind picked up. Dust swirled across the gravel road leading to the chapel. And from the distance came the sound of hooves, a horse galloping fast, the sound echoing off the hills. Heads turned toward the door as it burst open. Sunlight spilling across the wooden floor. A tall man stepped in, boots heavy with dust, hat low over his brow, a leather vest worn from years of work under the sun. Caleb Ward, the cowboy from the neighboring ranch. A man known for his quiet strength, for his word that never broke. He wasn't supposed to be here. He wasn't supposed to see her like this. But he did. Caleb's eyes locked on Lydia, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. He saw the tears she refused to shed, the tremble of her lips as she fought to stay standing. He saw the ache of betrayal written all over her face. And without a word he stepped forward, his boots echoing across the floor. Everyone stared, unsure of what was happening. But Lydia didn't move. She couldn't. She was frozen in the middle of her own heartbreak, her dreams scattering like petals in the wind. Caleb stopped a few feet from her. He took off his hat, held it over his chest, and looked at her with something deeper than pity, something like fierce, protective compassion. "Lydia," he said softly, his voice steady as the earth itself. "He's not worth your tears." Her eyes widened, her lips parting as though to speak, but no sound came. The words she'd been holding back. Why? How, what now? All tangled in her throat. Caleb's gaze flicked to the door, to the empty road beyond. "He ain't coming." "Folks say he's gone. Took his truck and left town this morning." The murmurs in the church rose again, disbelief spreading like wildfire. Lydia's knees wavered. For a heartbeat, she thought she might collapse right there in the aisle, her veil pooling around her feet. But before she could fall, Caleb reached out and caught her bouquet, steadying her trembling hand with his own. His touch was warm, grounding. "Don't let this be the end of you," he said quietly. He walked away. "But that don't mean you have to lose yourself, too." Tears finally slipped down her cheeks, silent and heavy. Why would he do this?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "I gave him everything." "I believed him." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Some men don't know how to treasure what's good. They mistake loyalty for weakness. But you deserve better than a man who runs when life gets hard." She looked up at him then, really looked at him. The sunlight caught his dark eyes, the kind that held 1,000 quiet stories, the kind that never lied. He didn't look at her like she was broken. He looked at her like she was someone worth saving. The guests began to leave, one by one, their footsteps fading until only the two of them remained. The empty pews stood silent witness to her heartbreak. The altar, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a tomb of shattered dreams. "I can't stay here," she whispered. Caleb nodded once. Then don't. You don't owe anyone your pain. He led her outside into the afternoon sun. The wind carried the scent of sage and dust. Her veil fluttered in the breeze as she looked. Out over the open fields, the same fields they'd both grown up around, the same land that held every memory of home. For a long moment she said nothing. Then quietly, "What happens now?" Caleb looked at her, his hat back in place, his hand resting on the saddle of his horse. "Now," he said, "you start again." She gave a small, hollow laugh. "Start again? With what? I've spent years building my life around someone who didn't even stay." He stepped closer. "Then build it around yourself. Around the things that make you feel alive again. I can help with that if you'll let me." She met his eyes, confusion and hesitation battling the small flicker of hope that dared to rise. "Why would you help me, Caleb?" His answer came without pause. "Because you've always deserved someone who'd stay, and I've always wanted to be that man." Her breath caught. For a second, she couldn't tell if it was the ache of heartbreak or the stir of something new inside her chest. She shook her head slightly. "You don't have to do this." "I know," his voice softened. "But I want to." The afternoon sun dipped lower, painting the sky in gold. Caleb extended his hand to her, not as a rescuer, not as a man taking advantage of her pain, but as someone offering a quiet promise of steadiness. She looked at his hand for a long time, then slowly placed hers in his. And in that touch something shifted. The pain was still there, raw and real, but so was the first spark of strength. As they walked toward his horse, Lydia looked back one last time at the church. The empty doorway framed the memory of everything she'd lost. But as she turned away, the world ahead seemed vast and open. A blank canvas painted with the colors of a second chance. Caleb helped her up onto the saddle behind him. The leather creaked. The wind whispered through the tall grass. He looked over his shoulder and said quietly but firmly, "If he won't have you, Lydia, I'll treasure you forever." Her breath hitched. She wanted to protest, to tell him not to make promises, because she'd seen how easily they could break. But when she saw the conviction in his eyes, she stayed silent. Maybe this time the words weren't empty. Maybe this time they were real. As the horse moved forward down the dusty road, Lydia closed her eyes, letting the wind dry her tears. Behind them, the church grew smaller, fading into the horizon. Ahead, the sunset stretched wide and endless, just like the future she hadn't thought she'd ever see again. For the first time in years, she didn't feel trapped in someone else's story. She felt free. The morning sun spilled over the open plains, turning the tall grass gold. A few weeks had passed since the day Lydia Monroe walked away from the church with Caleb Ward. Time, as it always does, softened the edges of heartbreak, but it hadn't erased it. The memory of that empty altar still haunted her dreams, a quiet ache that lingered beneath the surface. She now lived at Silver Creek Ranch, a few miles from town, a place where the air smelled of pine and wildflowers, and the sound of horses filled the quiet hours. Caleb had offered her a small guest cabin by the barn, giving her space and time, never asking for more than she could give. He worked the ranch from sunrise to sundown, and though he rarely said much, Lydia had learned to find comfort in his presence, the steady rhythm of his days, the way he never looked at her with pity, only patience. Every morning she'd wake to the sound of his boots on the porch, his voice low as he talked to his horses like old friends. Sometimes she'd bring him coffee, and they'd stand together in silence watching the mist lift off the fields. He never asked about Nathan. He never asked about the wedding. And maybe that's why she slowly found herself wanting to talk about it, because Caleb wasn't pushing her to forget. He was helping her learn to live again. One afternoon, as the sun sank low behind the hills, Lydia sat by the fence painting. The wind played with her hair, and the smell of hay and dust filled the air. Caleb rode in from the far pasture, his horse kicking up little clouds of golden light. When he dismounted, he paused to watch her, quietly, respectfully, as though afraid to break the fragile peace she'd found. "That's real pretty," he said finally, his voice rough from the day. "You've got a gift." She smiled faintly, dipping her brush into the color. "It's something I used to love. I stopped for a while, thought it didn't matter anymore." Caleb leaned on the fence beside her, watching her paint. "Reckon the things that make you feel alive always matter. You just forget sometimes." Lydia glanced up at him. "You make it sound so simple." He chuckled low and warm. "Ain't much in life that simple. But holding on to what makes your heart beat a little stronger, that's worth fighting for." She set down the brush, looking at him fully. The light caught the side of his face, the faint scar on his cheek, the strength in his jaw. Why do you care so much, Caleb? You barely knew me before that day. He looked at her a long moment before answering. Because I know what it feels like to be left standing alone. Lost someone once too. Figured maybe if I could help you find your feet, I'd make peace with my own ghosts. His words hung in the air like a confession carried on the wind. Lydia's heart softened. For the first time, she saw past his calm strength and into the quiet pain he carried. Who was she? She asked gently. He smiled sadly. Her name was Claire. We were supposed to start a life together after I came back from Texas. But when I did, she was gone. Said she couldn't wait forever for a man who didn't know what he wanted. She was right, he exhaled slowly. Since then, I've learned that when you find something, or someone, worth holding on to, you don't walk away. The silence between them deepened, filled only by the whisper of the wind through the grass. Lydia looked down at her hands. Maybe I should have seen it coming, she murmured. Nathan always said he loved adventure, but he didn't want responsibility. I guess I thought love would change that. Caleb shook his head. Love doesn't change a man. It reveals who he really is. Something in her heart shifted. His words struck a truth she'd been afraid to face. She realized then that what she'd mistaken for love with Nathan had been hope, and hope without honesty can be a dangerous thing. The next few days rolled by gently. Lydia found herself laughing again, softly, quietly at first, then freely. She rode horses with Caleb, helped with the morning feed, and learned to mend fences with her own 2 hands. Her wedding gown hung untouched in the corner of her cabin, but it no longer looked like a symbol of failure. It looked like a reminder of what she'd survived. One evening, a summer storm rolled over the valley. The sky turned black and the wind howled through the fields. Lydia stood by the barn door as the rain poured down in sheets. Caleb rushed in, soaked to the bone, carrying a stray calf in his arms. He set it down gently on the hay and laughed, pushing his wet hair from his eyes. You always run toward the trouble, don't you? She teased, grabbing a towel. He grinned. Somebody's got to keep things together around here. As thunder rumbled overhead, she helped him dry the calf, their hands brushing now and then. Each touch lingered a moment longer than it should. The air between them felt different, charged, alive. When the storm eased, the barn lights glowed soft and golden. Caleb leaned against the stall door, watching her with that same quiet gaze that had steadied her since the day they met. You've changed, Lydia, he said gently. The way you smile now, it's different, stronger. She hesitated, her voice barely a whisper. Maybe that's because someone reminded me I was worth more than being left behind. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate. You were always worth more. You just needed to see it for yourself. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. The sound of rain on the roof filled the silence. Then Lydia met his eyes, tears glistening, not of sorrow this time, but gratitude. You saved me, Caleb, she said softly. He shook his head. No, ma'am. You saved yourself. I just stood close enough to make sure you didn't forget how. Her chest tightened, emotion swelling until she couldn't hold it back. You said you'd treasure me forever, she whispered. Did you mean it? He reached out, brushing a wet strand of hair from her face, his hand trembling slightly. I don't make promises I can't keep. And in that moment, under the soft hum of rain, he kissed her, gentle at first, like a whisper of sunlight breaking through storm clouds. It wasn't desperate or hurried. It was steady, patient, and full of everything unspoken between them. When they pulled apart, Lydia's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they carried hope. What if I'm still broken? She asked. Caleb smiled faintly. Then we'll fix what's left, one piece at a time, together. Months passed. The fields turned green again, and the scars of the storm faded into the rhythm of everyday life. Lydia's laughter filled the ranch like music. She painted again, portraits of wild horses, of sunsets over Silver Creek, and one of a man standing by a white fence, hat in hand, watching her with quiet devotion. One evening, as the sky blazed pink and gold, Caleb led her to the top of the ridge overlooking the valley. The air was warm, the scent of summer thick in the wind. He took her hand, his thumb brushing over her ring finger. I ain't got much to offer, he said softly. But I can promise you this, I'll never walk away. Not when things get hard, not when life gets messy. I'll be right here, same as I've